Thank you very much for the welcome to this territory and also the insights of the speakers, particularly the reminder of Susan that the great gift of her culture to Canada and to the world is the awareness that the great cultural project of human history is the making of peace and the ongoing work of making peace. I'll first of all say that my story is a personal story. I live on Mi'kmaq territory, and much of the work that I'll be showing has been done in the context of Mi'kmaq culture, and it's a process of what I learned about architecture, bringing the eyes of an architect to Mi'kmaq culture. I'm an immigrant to I'm from an immigrant family, first of all, to Canada. Grew up on the prairies. Parents who immigrated here from the former Soviet Union. We lived in Manitoba. Then I went to the UK, qualified to be an architect, practiced for many years, and then in 1991 moved to Nova Scotia, where I went from full-time practice to teaching architecture. And so I brought the eyes of an architect in a way to that cultural experience of living on Mi'kmaq territory. This is a kind of, it gives you a sort of a diagram of why Nova Scotia was a kind of contested territory early on. The Mi'kmaq always say that they were the first ones to deal with European cultures. And so even long before Columbus, Europeans were coming offshore here, particularly the Portuguese and the Basques who were coming here to fish because of the rich fishing banks here. And they could catch the kind of currents as well and make a kind of annual cycle. We know the Vikings were also there from early on. And so there's a long period of contact. It was also a place of conflict because the French were the first to start to occupy that territory, but then the English were down here. But for the English to go home, they had to take this route up here, and so they always had to go right by Nova Scotia. And the French built a large fortress here that they used to sort of pick off the English, and so there was a conflict early on between the English and the French that impinged greatly on the indigenous people as well. So I'm not going to talk about history in particular. I'm going to talk again from a personal point of view. I don't represent Mi'kmaq culture. I'm learning a lot about Mi'kmaq culture through my involvements within that culture. I'm having trouble advancing the first slide, so I'm not sure why. No. Okay, let's just try again. This is a place where I live, right on the coast. This is Sambro Light. It's also the evidence of the earliest European settlement on the continent. This was built in the mid-1700s. It's still existing. Again, the slide's not advancing for me. There. So, of course, those were the shipping days of sail. A lot of the life of the economic life was significant to Europe because of the presence of wood that was used for the building of sailing ships, and also fish. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. And a lot of let's say natural wealth was produced in that area. A lot of it claimed, of course, over the years by the Europeans who were coming in. This is wood. Giant rafts of wood were exported to the United States, to the UK, and so on. I'm not going to again go on at length about the history. This kind of ubiquitous timber stamp is in a way still a vestige of a colonial relationship. This stamp isn't available to most First Nations. You have to be a large timber company to be able to have the right to stamp your sawn wood with this stamp. And you won't be allowed to build a house with it or to build, let's say, a funded building unless you have this stamp on your timber. And that's a stamp that's hard to come by if you're a small First Nations community. That issue will come up later. You know, one of the things that interested me about, you know, coming back to Nova Scotia was the sort of culture of how the material environment, let's say, supported cultural life. And that relationship between cultures and their material environment, how they derived support from that environment. So my interest in the culture was, you could say, a kind of interest in the instrumentality of what they did, not necessarily the symbology or the metaphors or even the, because I was ignorant of those things largely, not even, let's say, necessarily the worldview. I just wanted to know how they did things and why they did them in a way that supported their lives. And so coming at it as a kind of architect and a kind of, you could say, from a scientific point of view. The Mi'kmaq used to make hockey sticks, and this is a photo from the 1920s. They would, they made the sticks for the Boston Bruins and some of the Montreal Canadiens. So to this day, we have a kind of divided loyalty between those two teams. One of the first things that I did when I went from full-time practice, as I said, to full-time teaching. And the first summer of my time back in Canada and in Mi'kmaq territory was I'd always dreamt of building a birch bark canoe, because the birch bark canoe is I understood it as still a kind of contemporary object. The canoe is still very much in use. In a way, it's an iconic design within Canada. And so that first summer here, I set out to build a birch bark canoe. Again, I tried to find someone who had built one. Within Mi'kmaq world, I couldn't find someone. I eventually got hold of William Kabanda from Quebec, Ontario territory. We weren't able to get him, so we just set out to build one based on documents that we had come up with. And that was a profound experience. These are the parts. It was in every way a very kind of contemporary design made from a kit of parts. You could imagine it almost as a sort of IKEA catalog item. We used to trade from this to birch bark could be traded, the various components could be traded, it could be taken apart and popped back together. It could be repaired on the fly because it was all mostly friction fit. It could be relatively quickly built. I'm not going to show you how to actually build one, but you didn't work from drawings, you worked from a process, and so the first thing you made became the template for the next thing you made, and that became the template for the next thing you made. And each thing could also be shaped by how it was going to be used in the environment. So this little detail, every little detail had some relevance to how it would function. This was there so that you could lash a paddle when you were portaging, and that paddle would sit on your shoulders. And so each thing that you did had some correspondence to both where it came from and then where it was going. And so no drawings involved. Once you embarked on a process, that process also involved that flow of information. And so the flow of information became a thing of great interest. About that time, too, I was, by other set of coincidences, meeting Mi'kmaq people who've become, since, I would say, lifelong friends. And Medina Marshall has been a wonderful elder. a mother and grandmother to my children, and a great friend. One of the things that I remember having a profound effect on how I thought and worked, she said, in our language there are no nouns, only verbs. Things are not objects, they are animate and are understood in terms of their relationship with each other. And so that had a profound influence as well on how I thought about design, and how there was a sort of growing awareness that everything has its own animate spirit, if you like, and that we live in a field of overlapping relationships. And understanding those relationships is key to how we might make something. And so that sort of first lesson of making this sort of quintessential artifact became a lesson in that process. And I have this notion that to this day, both the canoe and the kayak are the most sophisticated design, you could say, items to come out of North American culture, certainly out of Canadian culture. They maintain their contemporary relevance, and they both emerge from a history that goes back to before the pyramids were made. So they were making these back when they were building the pyramids, and arguably these were much more useful. They also emerged from the forest, and they emerged back into the forest. About that time, I wasn't setting out particularly to do a study of Mi'kmaq culture, and that's not strictly speaking, by the way, an ocean-going canoe. That's more of a sort of inland canoe for inland waters, and you can tell that just by a reading of the details and the shape of it. But as I did that project, through a set of coincidences, I was asked to participate by a community called Eskasoni First Nation. They had a chance to access a subsidy program to do green building. And they came to the university and asked if there was someone who could help them write a proposal. And because I had done the canoes, the secretaries at the university directed them to me. So that was kind of you could say, either a case of divine intervention or just, crazy coincidence. And so I did. I went to the community, and they had already been advised they should do a straw bale building, and that would land them the grant. And I love straw bale buildings. I come from straw bale country. I knew all about straw bales. I built many straw bale stacks. But I said, I don't see any straw around here. Like, where are we going to get the straw? And so then I said, you live in the forest. Do you have people who could still tell me how things were? You've survived many thousands of years in these forests, how you used to build things. And the people I was dealing with were part of the council and so on. They said, well, there's some, fringe people, we call them purists, who still do things like go for sweats, build sweat lodges, and so on. And I said, well, I want to meet them. I want to meet them because, and so they, after some time in a series of tests that I won't go into, they also agreed to work with me. And this was one of the first projects we did together. We built a sort of lodge. It's almost like a living capsule, which could be thatched with fir boughs. But it was, as I said, the sort of smallest component for living. They had different configurations of dwellings that they lived in. But I was, again, studying it from an architect kind of scientific point of view. It made huge sense because you create a kind of thermal umbrella of layered insulation. Then you heat the ground, and you heat it with stones from a fire outside to keep the air pure. That over time, that ground underneath this thermal umbrella gets heated. And you introduce fresh air here through convection. and so on. So to me, it made whatever, there are many metaphors for it and so on, but whatever those were, it made great scientific sense. And it explained why you could survive for many thousands of years in that environment. So when I began to embark on this study with classes of various kinds, we would also meet the elders who worked in wood. This is Peter Pullet. He's making wooden baskets and taught us how to split wood along its growth rings. He taught us that you try not to use a saw on wood because wood consists of bundled fibers. It's been optimally configured by nature to resist bending and to be pliable. And so in order to preserve its strength and its inherent qualities, you always work with the grain of the wood intact. And so when you cut it, you're essentially violating that wood. And so that started to cause me to think about a whole new way of using wood. John Henry Lafford, he was one of those people who still was building things the way his grandfather had taught him. And again, as he recounts it, they lived in smaller scale longhouses in more recent times. We don't know. We know that they built larger longhouses. There are accounts of up to 200 or 300 people meeting in one of these structures. So that gives some sense of scale. But here we're building a smaller longhouse, which went on to become a kind of change room for the community sweat lodge. John was. We laughed a lot when you always laugh a lot when you're with John, and you never if you don't know him well, you never quite know when he's joking or when he's not. In fact, if you do know him, you don't quite know. But so one of the things he told the students, before you take a tree, you talk to that tree and you explain what is happening, and you also tell that tree that what you're doing, how it will honor that tree, and you also thank it for what it's bringing. And I assured my students that he wasn't joking, and so that awareness he also brought, that again, all of life, all of nature around us is animate, and it's also cognizant, and so we need to communicate with it, we need to honor it, and we need to constantly be thankful. So we built many of these things, and we built variations of them. And I began to think about how some of these ways of thinking and also these ways of working with wood could be scaled up. How scalable were they? This is just one of the structures that had an influence on me. This is an archival photo of a longhouse from Ojibwe territory. I thought, yeah, you could practically play hockey under that thing. So it got me thinking about how we could scale this up. And so again, working with John, also a friend named Barry Bernard, we started to build things like grid shells of various kinds. And this experiment, we sort of established how you could increase the strength of that thing. You might build the first layer. These are birch saplings, so you work them when they're green. The first layer might go up fairly easily because it's light, and then you use that layer as a scaffold and start to layer more things up until you have whatever strength you want. So it's again, we're looking at the kind of scalable nature of that process. We're not working from drawings, we're just with students in the woods, kind of working with the material. At this point, it's a kind of collaboration between myself and my Mi'kmaq friends. Interested too in what kinds of structures we might build. This is an early bridge. over a small stream. Interested in how flexible is the wood, what are the formal limits of how far it can bend and so on. And then I got together a group of students, grad students, and also School of Art students, and it was a kind of one of those 1/2 credit electives. We built this close to Halifax in the woods because of with commutable distance, and I was out there most of the week, and then students would sort of cycle in and out. But we set this agenda to build a habitable structure using material that was only within walking distance of the site, using some of those principles we had learned from Mi'kmaq World. And we didn't work from drawings. Again, we worked full scale in real material. So as a group, we developed some strategies together. We built a few study models, and then built some full-scale tests. Essentially, we're anchoring vertical elements and then bending them into position. And then I think you get a sense of the process. And then we started to layer things up. There was always the strategy about making things in layers, unlike, let's say, a European approach where you build sort of stereotomically, or you build massive things and pile them up. In, let's say, in the Mi'kmaq vocabulary of the act of building, you make very light things. You maximize their structural efficiency, first of all, by not sawing them, but also by making curvatures, whether it's the boat, whether it's a lodge, whether it's a longhouse. And then you layer them up. You make a thing that's a thing of layers. And if you think about it, that's influenced the way we think about building in Canada generally. Arguably, balloon framing is a kind of development of that. It's very rare to find balloon framing outside North America. So there are some studies that show that transfer of ideas had an influence in how we think about building generally on this continent. But I wanted to sort of peel it back a bit further. So, the first layer goes on, the second layer goes on, then a third layer of those horizontals again, saplings that would take the fastening for the cladding. We left out an insulation. We could have added an insulation layer. It meant collecting a lot of sphagnum moss, which we didn't have time for, so we just kind of cut to the chase and did the final cladding attached to those horizontal rings of saplings. So again, a kind of notion of how a building might come together. And also how we did the drawings after the fact as a documentation of the process, but also this notion of emerging information, how, if you like, the information embedded in the things around you can result in something that arguably has been born from the land on which it sits. Now, that doesn't mean that emergent form has one possible outcome. It has infinite outcomes in a way. A beaver, a moose, and a spruce tree coexist on the same territory, and they both have a profound relationship that allows them a continued life on that territory, but very different formal strategies for how they do that. And so the same might be true of an architecture. Now, in this case, my Mi'kmaq friends live 5 hours from Halifax, so they weren't able to be involved in this. But when we were done, I took them back here to see, to get their feedback and critique, and they sort of surprised me at first. I mean, they were totally, enamored with it. They were amazed. But they were incredibly upset with me, and I won't repeat what they said, but you know, it was partly funny and partly just obscene, but called me a complete idiot. Why did you build this here in redneck territory, as they said, you know, it's just going to be vandalized. And so they said, you got to take this out of here and you got to take it to Mi'kmaq communities. I mean, you know, and so they even discussed getting a helicopter to lift it out of here. They wanted to put it on a flatbed truck and truck it around. And in a way, I was kind of heartbroken. I thought, yeah, we went to all that effort, and here it was kind of it was just out of sight of a few subdivisions. And again, it was for reasons of efficiency. But that, in a way, led to another project, because there was no way we could move it. And so they said, okay, you have to commit to doing something, that we together will do something in a Mi'kmaq community. It was good advice, because this thing was vandalized, first spray painted, then burnt, and so on. And one of the people was the partner of Merdina, Dr. Merdina Marshall, Albert Marshall. And so he said, Richard, you've got to come to Eskasoni and we'll build something like it there. And Albert was part of that project then. In the meantime, I was working on various projects that didn't go ahead. I'll just sort of flip through a few of them. They were done at the request of Mi'kmaq elders. This was a couple of proposals for a Mi'kmaq governance center, something that never came to fruition, but a group of elders wanted me to develop some proposals for discussion to help catalyze the process of creating a united Mi'kmaq governance center. So that was work that I did at the request of elders within the community, based on what they knew about what I was doing. So I won't dwell on those, but at this time I was thinking, how can we start to build some of these things to contemporary standards, where you have to do drawings in advance, so you have to deal with tolerances, you have to deal with predictable behavior. In other words, you have to prove something is structurally sound, and sound in energy terms and all those terms. You have to prove it mathematically before you will be given permission to build. You can't just, let's say, go out and build something and then expect to get funding and so on. And it would be, in the contemporary context, from my point of view, it's also irresponsible. But you know, based on the study of what trees would do, some of it from experiments, some of it just from observation. We've all seen these trees in the forest. These are perfectly healthy spruce trees that are capable of quite a bit of flexibility without damaging their fibers or compromising their structure. Again, also going into the forest, seeing what's the most efficient way to bend them, what kinds of bends can you get, how green do they have to be, what's the sort of window of opportunity for bending them after you've cut them, all of those things. We also knew that to increase their structural capability and also their dimensional predictability, we could start to pair them. And so did a lot of experiments creating different kinds of truss forms and different connection strategies. So a lot of iterations of this process. And then also doing strength tests, breaking them, see when do they break, how do they break, and so on. And in the case of their fabrication, drawing on all sorts of fabrication processes that indigenous people use, from soaking wood to soaking it and pouring hot water over it, to steaming it, to and so on, and the sort of artifacts that might result. This is a case of a project that I did with a colleague, in a way to see what's the maximum formal capability of a piece of green spruce tree. This was a sculpture we did. Merdina called it the hummingbird. And this was built, the structure is with spruce trees, and the netting is fish net that's been dyed various colors. And this is how we built it. So we kind of borrowed an idea from how you bend the bow in a canoe. You need a very tight bend in the bow. It's rare that you will find it's probably impossible that you will find a tree that takes that bend without breaking. And so what you do is you slice it. Then you bend it, and then you fasten it back together. So there's a kind of combination of bending and laminating. And in this case, we also built it to a specific drawing. It wasn't just a free form. We had built a wire model, and then we built the wood so that it was dimensionally accurate to the drawing, again, as a test of a principle of working. And so here you see we built a template that allows that thing to bend in 3 dimensions, that piece of wood as it goes back together. So first we unzip it, and then we sort of zip it back together. And then, again, this is the beginning of the project we now did at Albert's place. So this is the forming process, so we can get now a dimensionally accurate piece of building material. So when we built the next structure, it was at Albert and Merdina Marshall's house, and we thought rather than recreate, the one we had done in the woods, let's build one that we've pre-drawn, where we have to build it to a set of drawings. We'll have structural calculations, and we'll change the process slightly so that we can learn something from each thing that we do. So here we are prefabricating those rib elements. This was an image from a painting that had an effect also on how I thought about the cross-section. This is a longhouse structure from Ojibwe territory near the Manitoba-Ontario border. It's from late 19th century, and so this is just a detail of a larger painting. I was interested that the headdress is the same as Mi'kmaq headdress from that period, and it also aligns with the story that at least many of the Ojibwe came from the East Coast. So within their own legends, they tell of coming from the East Coast originally, because the prophets told them of a sort of upcoming kind of Holocaust brought on by Europeans. And so I was interested in the headdress, but then I was also interested in this little detail of a longhouse, the notion of the layers. So there's, this layer, then the next layer, and then this kind of clamping layer. So this sort of a building cross-section as an assembly of lightweight elements. And so that kind of, that also partly went into how we began to develop that section. This is now Albert and Merdina's house. Merdina was just starting a Mi'kmaq Studies department, the first of its kind at Cape Breton University, which is maybe half an hour from Eskasoni. And she also does a lot of counseling, so she needed a space to meet as a counselor, and then also to conduct. It became a classroom for Mi'kmaq Studies department. She wanted it attached to the house. She said that would save them doing a washroom in here, which would make sense. So the kind of the design of it evolved as we went. I'll just take you through it quickly. So first the ribs go up. They're all done to precise dimensions. Then the next layer goes on, these kind of horizontals, which is kind of like, if you view it as a rib cage, these are sort of muscles that hold those together. And they can also they can also form their own kind of scaffolding as you go up the building. Then the fat goes on the ribs, so this kind of layering of insulation, which has grooves in it for these 1x3s, and those get screwed through. So they also provide further stability. So with each layer, you get added stability. You also start to get thermal performance. And then again, that final layer, you start to add the shingles. So each layer uses, uses very, very little material, but uses it to maximum advantage. And then from the inside, you complete those gaps by creating this kind of sheathing inside. And so this little conference room became, as I said, the first classroom for the Mi'kmaq Studies Department. A lot of their studies consisted of working in the field, in nature, and it went within communities, consistent with a kind of Mi'kmaq notion of how learning takes place. So this is where they would get together for discussions. And it also became, if you like, the birthplace of the notion of what's come to be known, and Albert invented this term as far as I know, two-eyed seeing. And Albert and Medina both developed this notion for the university that Indigenous perspective needed to be brought to university. It wasn't just a case of, let's say, one body of knowledge or history as juxtaposed with another body of knowledge or history, but it also involved different ways of knowing things, different ways of learning things, and different ways of coming to know things that might profoundly differ from one world to the other. And so also the notion that indigenous ways of thinking and doing could have a profound contribution on how, let's say, Western knowledge systems practice science. And that the way that you come to know the world and to come to understand nature can be through different paths and different routes. And so that was something that, an idea that, let's say, was a subject of many days of discussion between us as we were working on some of these projects. And first of all, my intent for being involved in the project was, if you like, my own personal learning process. I was there to learn what I could about ways of doing things, and then to see how they might result in new things based on what I had learned. So it's a very personal, again, I'm not trying to, I'm not posing as a spokesperson for any way of thinking other than my own, but it also, for me, led to a way of working where, as a check on what I was doing, I would go to the elders and say, should I be involved in this or this project? Does it honor your culture or not? If it doesn't, I won't be involved. Is this way of doing things honoring your culture? Is it honoring nature? If it's not, I won't be involved in doing it. And so it's a way of working also that defers to the elders, if you like. And so that's an important process in the work as it unfolded. So that this little, very modest project had, again, a profound way on how I was thinking. And it also meant that, you could, in terms of process, the process was scalable. In other words, it hits all the targets. It can be built to precise drawings, and drawing to be done in advance and submitted for all the approvals. The structural ratings are all there. We can do calculations on the structures. We can get engineers to stamp the drawings. That wasn't as easy as you might think. In the first instance, I went to British engineers because I couldn't find the Canadian ones. I mean, I shouldn't say that they didn't exist. I just couldn't find them. So Bureau Happold, they didn't do the structure on this building, but they did the structures on some of the larger versions of it that weren't built. But those structural calculations became useful in the long run. Because this is now the community of Pictou Landing First Nation, Mi'kmaq First Nation in Pictou Landing, Nova Scotia. Another community, they had a block of funding available to build a community health center. And the funding came through Health Canada. And Health Canada, you know, like any federal department, they have their architects that they work with. I won't say how they're picked. You can draw your own conclusions. Most of the health centers were built where they were built to be vandal-proof, you know, non-flammable, bars on the windows. Pictou Landing First Nation invited, the chief of Pictou Landing First Nation, first of all, was a wonderful, strong woman named Anne Francis. And she said to Health Canada, "That is not your money, that's our money that you've owed us for a very long time. And so we will pick the architect." And she was very insistent, and so they had an interview process. I was interviewed along with probably a dozen architects. And in the end, I was selected to be the architect, much to the chagrin of Health Canada. But it led to a very interesting relationship. So my client was, my allegiance, first of all, was to the community, of course, and to the culture, and to my elder advisors, to my community. But my funding, my payments were coming from Health Canada. And of course, we had to satisfy all the, quite rightly, all the stringent requirements of any federal project in terms of building codes and structural codes. This is just a typical house in Pictou Landing. They're a fishing community, but most of their fishing takes place about 4 hours from here because their local waters have been polluted. You might hear some of this on the national news. This is Boat Harbor. This is the effluent from a nearby pulp plant. This is on Mi'kmaq territory. A few years ago, the pulp company was granted the concession of pumping their effluent onto Mi'kmaq territory. They did this secretly, of course. This is giving off a lot of hydrogen sulfide gas, and it's killing the local environment, killing the potential for any shell fishing or any fishing at all, for that matter. And I think here you can kind of see, here's the pulp mill, here's the effluent pond, here, and the water's going this way. Here's Pictou Landing First Nation. This is the immigrant Scottish community of Pictou. You can see why they didn't want their effluent to go through here. I mean, it gives off a lot of fumes as well, hydrogen sulfide and other fumes that blow right over this community, lead to a lot of health issues. You can see they didn't want it to go here. It avoids, it sort of bypasses the white community. This situation evolved in the 60s and 70s. Pictou Landing First Nation first tried to sue this company. It then transpired that this company had been given permission by the province to do this, and so then they switched the suit to the province. You know how much, you have some sense of how much lawyers cost, so this is many decades of lawyers' fees sunk into that from a small community. As they were suing the province, they intercepted a bit of correspondence. They had federal lawyers. They had convinced the Department of Indian Affairs in those days to fund lawyers to sue the province, which they did. Then they found some correspondence between their federal lawyers saying, actually, we as the feds are culpable because we're the ones who said, yeah, you can pump it over here. So then the community was left in the lurch because their own lawyers were compromised. They then, these are more details of the same. They then had to find a lawyer. They had no money to fund further lawyer fees. So one of the great cultural heroes of Nova Scotia is Rocky Jones, who's a lawyer civil rights lawyer primarily from Halifax, fought many issues related to African Nova Scotians, but he took on the Pictou Landing lawsuit. He took it on speculation, so for no fee, on the faith that they would win. They did win. They fought it up to Supreme Court level, and they won. It hasn't changed a thing. Boat Harbor is still there. Those effluent ponds are still there. So in spite of the fact that the community had won in the highest court in Canada, nothing has changed. Yeah, so that I just want to give you some background to the sort of, in a way, this impinges on our project. So I'll sort of jump back and forth from that situation. Here we are with the forestry manager starting to select the trees that we will use to make the building. We would cut the trees and then we would put them in a local pond in the community to keep them supple for as long as possible. These are just some of the early, these are fairly late into it, but some of the development sketches for the project. We had a lot of design meetings with the community. The community made it clear that this would be a cultural building. Health Canada says this will not be a cultural building. This is purely health. And the chief and council said, well, health is cultural. And so there are many things, there were many tensions that we sort of negotiated. We had also taken the stand that we would use local people to build the building and we would use local materials whenever possible, so that much of the money was spent within the community that would stay in the community as possible. This was one of the later models that I built, just to give you a quick. So this is kind of sweeping around to make this space. It's a wind protected space. The prevailing north winds are from this side coming off the ocean. This becomes a sort of sun trap. And the plan was to make this also a medicine garden. And then the clinics would be inside here, and the clinics would have views out over the ocean. Each clinic would have access to daylight, and we would maximize the daylighting. Again, you know, this method of bending the trees, and then a lot of the reason that we could build this, and you know, we did a huge package of working drawings for it, many details and so on, but it was because we had built that what came to be known the West Wing at Merdina's house, that we could say, you know, to the local builders, this is how we did it there. You know, a bunch of students did it there. Hey, you guys can do it. And so we spent a lot of time training the local crew. And it is a pretty straightforward process. And although we did have the drawings, it's not unlike the canoe process, in that the first thing you do becomes a template for the next thing and the next thing and so on. And so rather than, you know, just look at the end point and the starting point, you say, well, the starting point will tell you what to do in the next point and so on. So here you can see some of that process. And the kind of later stages, some of the detailing inside. So the emergent form of the project, again, you could say, well, at some level, I like to say the building kind of designed itself. You're given a set of stringent requirements, first of all, from the funder, Health Canada. So it's got to have a dentist's office, you know, a doctor, a community nurse, psychologist, all of that good stuff. But aside from that, of course, the cross-section is going to be given by the curvature that the trees will take. You're not going to draw a curve that you can't accomplish with a green spruce tree of the size required to satisfy the structure. The reason for the slope up toward the ends is because we wanted to also use that notion of airflow it's in longhouses, it's in lodges, where you use a stack effect. So all the hot air from here will, instead of having return ducts to every room, all the hot air from each room will float up to here in this wing and float up to here in this wing, and it'll be captured. It can either be ejected or taken down to a heat recovery ventilator so that we can recoup 60 to 70% of the heat from that outgoing air without having to do any return ducts. So we save a lot of money doing that. So that the profile this way is given by what the trees will do, and the profile this way is given by airflow. We built it into that bank that you saw. This is that south-facing side. We're using the mass of this bank to be part of the thermal strategy for keeping this place warm in winter and cool in the summer. What else can I say about this cross? The other thing this cross-section accomplishes is we can get rid of a couple of fire stairs, which, I mean, we're working on a very limited budget. So you know, putting a fire stair inside, which isn't really social space, costs you a lot of money. You got to heat that space and so on. So here we can have grade level exits at this level and grade level exits at this level. So, you know, someone maybe doing another kind of project might talk about it in terms of formal metaphors and so on. For me, you know, I had to justify based on instrumentality. I would argue based on, you know, good hard-nosed principles that my elder friends also respected, that that forms emerge for reasons related to how nature operates. Here's the final cladding on. So one of the things we did, this final wooden layer, although it's meant to be waterproof, there's a layer of waterproofing underneath that wood. This material is a kind of fabric, blue skin, that we put on, and we left it on through a few really strong downpours to make sure that the building was watertight before we put the wood on itself. The wood mostly protects this layer from sunlight. As many of you know, UV light is probably the biggest you know, thing to think about when we're thinking about material degradation. Again, some of the detailing. The windows were popped into the side so that the structure could just flow past the windows on the inside. And on the outside, we covered them with this membrane material. The wood was, any wood that was sawn within the community with wood sourced as locally as possible. This is now the waiting area. I'm not going into too much detail about some of the conflicts that arose in the community. I should say the first big conflict was the first day that the job started on site. Maybe I'll just say a bit about that. The first day the job started on site, the Government of Canada put up a big sign saying this is a Government of Canada funded project sponsored by Health Canada. They put it on the construction trailer, and then they put it as a standing sign next to it. The excavators came on site, and the first morning I got a phone call, and they said everything's been shot full of shotgun holes. The shotguns had blasted the signs to bits. They blasted the construction trailer to bits. They blasted the windows out of the excavators. And so that's what part of the reason I gave you some of the background on the relationship between, let's say, the Government of Canada and Pictou Landing First Nation. So we went to a hastily convened meeting of the Chief and Council and the Health Canada officials, and Health Canada proposed putting 24-hour surveillance, basically armed guards on the site. And you know, I quickly pointed out that the budget for that would be more than the budget for the whole building. And the chief the chief and council and I had met someone in advance, and so they said, you know, you will take down all references to Government of Canada project. This is not a Government of Canada project, by the way. This is a Pictou Landing First Nation project with the government money that's been owed to us. Yeah. Okay. So we're on Mi'kmaq time now, I'm told. Anyway, that's some of the background. We also agreed that there would be no security on the site. There were no locks on any doors. The site was accessible by everyone at all times of the day or night. We never had we had meetings with the community explaining this, and we never had a single incident of vandalism or theft for the duration of the project, or of any injuries on site. These are some of the tests we did on site. This is a sawmill that we built as a way to train the guys who were doing the ribs in it, and also to do the sawn wood for the sawn parts of the building. By the way, they got rid of the sawmill afterward because it was of no commercial value, because they didn't have access to these stamps. So no matter, they had the sawmill, they had the people, they had the trees, but they've had to cut their trees and sell them to a lumber company who then saws them and stamps them and gets all the profit. I'm not sure what we have for time. I'm just going to sort of speed ahead a bit. But this is my own house. And again, in a way, I'm not really an architect who works a lot with typologies, or not that I'm averse to it, or metaphors, but it did occur to me there's a sort of longhouse quality to it. But it sort of stretches east-west, north-south. That's how it is right about now. Using light wood, stacking it up for structural reasons. So all of those good principles, a lot of them I would say learned in the context of the work that I've done, and I wouldn't say it's in any way a Mi'kmaq building, but it's drawing on things that I'd learned from work in that culture. This is the inside. You can see the south side picking up the sun in the winter. The wooden baskets influenced how I did the cladding on the house. The location of the house, the entry is at this spot where there's an existing rock that we didn't want to move, so it becomes a sort of sun trap as well. I think I'm going to stop there. There are a few other projects maybe that I could show students in subsequent workshops. But just a couple of things to say in conclusion. Maybe the most profound thing, apart from the sort of material studies and where they've led me, the most profound thing that I learned related to the design process was to start to think of the world as not only animate, but kind of cognizant and sentient. And so all the forces that are part of any design project that have to do with the place, that have to do with the material, all of those things can be activated by us as we acknowledge them. Again, many things can emerge from those, but they'll always, whatever we do is a kind of orchestration of relationships. And so getting back to that profound idea that in a way our life's work as individuals and as a culture is to work with those relationships. If you could say it's a kind of peacemaking that happens at all levels, at all levels, literally. Anyway, walalin imsit nogama. Thank you.